On Primetime Asia tonight, a race against time for rescue teams to find survivors on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi as the deadline for rescue operations to stop approaches. And as the death toll climbs again to at least 1,424 people. Aid arrives for some of the thousands who've lost everything following Friday's deadly quake and tsunami.
Rosmah Mansor, wife of Malaysia's former Prime Minister Najib Razak, pleads not guilty to 17 counts of money laundering and tax evasion. Her lawyers say none of the charges are related to the State Fund 1MDB scandal.
Hello, I'm Glenda Chong.
I'm Steve Lai.
And also ahead, the last batch of Team Singapore are on their way to Indonesia for the Asian Para Games.
Yes, we'll get to that in a bit. Sarah, our colleague, joins us for the business news, with India set to welcome a special guest in the next few hours, Sarah.
Yeah, Steve, now India and Russia are set to deepen ties as President Vladimir Putin heads to New Delhi. But it could all come at a diplomatic and financial cost.
Our correspondents are on the ground in Sulawesi, where they've been seeing firsthand the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami. Shahida Osman, she's in Donggala, where over 300,000 people live, and it was closest to the epicenter of Friday's quake. She'll tell us about relief efforts there. And in a few minutes, we'll be live in Palu City with Saiful Bahri Ismail, now who's been at evacuation centers and has spoken to some of the survivors. So rescuers, now they have just one more day to find survivors from last week's devastating Indonesian earthquake and tsunami. The search, as we know, is being called off tomorrow. It comes as the National Disaster Management Agency says the death toll has risen to 1,424. But families of those missing say they are not giving up hope.
Saya masih berharap istri saya masih bisa selamat, tidak kurang apapun. Semoga Tuhan memberikan mujizat dan kuasanya. Saya masih berharap juga karena posisi istri saya juga lagi hamil 6 months.
Mereka sampaikan sama saya, Pak, anak saya tidak kembali. Saya bilang, ya, mau diapa?
More aid is finally making its way to survivors 6 days after the disaster struck. Hundreds of doctors, volunteers and emergency supplies have now been deployed in all affected regions.
The military has also begun evacuating the injured and families with young children. But authorities are still on high alert for looters, with the military saying they may shoot them if needed.
Foreign aid is also picking up pace. A military plane from the Australian Defence Forces on its way to Palu, part of a $3.6 million aid package pledged by Canberra, along with 50 medical professionals. And some 20 countries, they've offered their assistance, including Singapore, the US and the United Kingdom. And Saiful Bahri Ismail joins us from Palu right now. Saiful, we know that you visited evacuation centers today. What are the conditions like there?
Well, Glenda, evacuees are living in very sparse conditions. Most of them actually set up tents on their own because help has been slow to come. Evacuees told us that most of the food items that they receive actually come from kind-hearted individuals who had donated relief supplies to them. They also expressed concern that the food that they have will not last very long, and they hope that relief from the government can come soon. Now, we've spoken to survivors, and what is amazing is the strength and resilience that a lot of these survivors have. The community spirit in these evacuation centers that binds people together is still very strong. We see children still playing with one another, and they're smiling and laughing. It's as if nothing bad had actually happened. Now, we also saw people willing to help one another even in desperate times, and that's certainly very heartening to see. Now, we spoke with one survivor earlier today who was still searching for her missing husband, and she told us how she managed to escape during the earthquake.
Begitu kita keluar, tanah, jalanan sudah pecah terbelah-belah. Seperti layaknya ombak yang di laut gitu kan. Begitu saya lihat kanan kiri, makin menghimpit itu tanah. Makin dihimpit kita di jalan, makin dihimpit. Saya lihat rumah depan saya itu sudah terangkat dari pondasinya. Begitu jatuh sudah kita taruh, bruk. Alhamdulillah kita ada tanah naik. Dan kita dapat pijakan sampai alhamdulillah kita selamat.
Yeah, harrowing ordeal, Saiful. Search and rescue operations, we understand, will be called off tomorrow. What's the progress been like in finding survivors?
Well, Steve, authorities are doing all they can to speed up the evacuation process. Now, having said that, we do understand that there are still many people who are still missing following the earthquake and a tsunami. Authorities say there are still some areas like in Sigi Regency which are unreachable. And in addition, it's believed that many victims are still buried in mud after an entire housing complex was swallowed by the earth in what is described as the liquefaction phenomenon. Now, local authorities say that the Balaroa housing complex was home to some 5,000 residents. They have managed to recover at least 150 dead bodies, and it's still unclear how many more are still buried in the debris and mud. Now, the death toll could yet increase, although not dramatically.
Saiful, aid, we know that it has been in short supply over the last few days. Has that situation been alleviated since?
Well, the situation has not been alleviated completely. As I did mention earlier, evacuees in some of the evacuation centers we visited told us that they have not received the relief supplies that they need. However, the Indonesian government is stepping up efforts to bring even more relief items to those affected and distribute them to those who need it. We do understand that authorities have deployed, for example, 4 tankers, which will bring some 11 million liters of fuel to affected areas. Now, this is certainly good news, because the shortage of fuel is one of the key concerns of many people here. We saw vehicles and people queuing up several kilometers just trying to get fuel, which they need to run their generator sets, because most part of Palu city is still in darkness. The power grids which were damaged during the earthquake have not been fully repaired. At the same time, the government has also urged communities here to open up their businesses so that the economy of the city can resume. But that's going to be hard to do when essentials like power has not been fully restored.
All right, thanks for that update there, Saiful. Saiful Bahri Ismail speaking to us live from Palu in central Sulawesi.
And let's go now to Donggala City, where Shahida Othman has been finding out about how rescue and relief efforts there have been getting on.
I'm in Donggala City, home to about 300,000 people. This is an area, as you mentioned, is the closest to the epicenter of the earthquake that struck on Friday. As you can see, there's destruction everywhere. Hundreds of homes and buildings have been damaged and reduced to rubble. I can see children's footwear, clothing and motorcycle helmets on the ground as well. People are desperate for food, clean drinking water and medicine to treat the injured and the sick. There are many reports of the elderly and children as well being untreated for high fever because of the extreme weather conditions. As you can see, it's it gets really hot in the day and extremely chilly at night. So they're exposed to these extreme weather conditions. And locals also tell me that each day they are still feeling about 3 to 4 aftershocks. So they are scared to go indoors. And for that, they need more tarpaulin sheets and tents to keep them sheltered at night and throughout the day. At this point, there hasn't been much focus on this part of the island, at least not before Indonesian President Joko Widodo visited the area on Tuesday. Electricity and communications are still down, but the roads have been cleared to make way for authorities and relief workers to start doing their assessments. So aid is finally slowly trickling down into this isolated part of the island. 6 days after the earthquake and tsunami struck, officials have said that they have not forgotten about Donggala. It's just the scale and the magnitude of the disasters is just so great, they require more time.
Yes, now Shahida Othman in Donggala, the city closest to the earthquake's epicenter.
And Sarah Kaldi is also up ahead with the day's business headlines.
Yes, and the IMF is raising some red flags, Sarah.
It is, Steve. It's sending a warning on Japan, saying risks are tilting more to the downside. We'll tell you why up next. Time for your business news. Russian President Vladimir Putin will land in India later this evening for a 2-day official visit. He will join Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in signing a $5 billion deal for S-400 surface-to-air missiles. But The U.S. State Department has issued a warning to India, and it says such transactions with Russia will trigger sanctions from Washington. As Neha Punya reports from New Delhi.
As New Delhi prepares for that crucial bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday, the U.S. has once again reiterated that any significant defense transaction with Moscow could invite sanctions for India. This week, the Kremlin issued a statement saying that the two leaders will sign that $5 billion deal for the S-400 surface-to-air missile system when they hold bilateral talks in New Delhi. The Indian government has neither confirmed nor denied if this deal will be signed this week. It's also chosen to not issue any statement on America's sanctions warning. Sources in the External Affairs Ministry say that they see the S-400 missile deal as one that is still being negotiated and not something that is a done deal yet. Sources add that any official statement will be issued only once President Putin's visit is over and if that deal is signed. Under a tough new law, the U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions on countries having defense ties with Russia. Last month, sanctions were imposed on China for incidentally purchasing the same Russian missile system. India's military is pushing for this missile purchase as a deterrent against China and to gain an edge over its traditional rival Pakistan. These missiles are able to track and shoot down combat aircraft at unprecedented ranges. The Indian Air Force says it wants the missile system delivered within 2 years. Experts say they hope New Delhi's increased defense reliance on American companies will mean that the Trump administration will be willing to ignore this particular deal and grant India a waiver. America is one of India's top arms suppliers with deals worth $15 billion signed in the last 10 years. Experts add that a militarily potent India is crucial to America's wider strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. Neha Punya, Channel News Asia, New Delhi.
The International Monetary Fund has a warning for Japan. It says the country is facing increased risks. Uncertainty over the impact of a planned sales tax hike next year and global trade tensions are some of the reasons why. Now, the lender added that Japan's growth could take a hit from changes in how consumers spend their money once taxes are increased. The IMF recommended that Japan maintain its accommodative monetary policy, this even as other major central banks are starting to tighten. But it said Japan's policy could also push banks to take on more risks. Well, staying with Japan, where tech giants SoftBank and Toyota are teaming up to develop car services. They'll focus on self-driving technology as they position for a future where fewer people will drive their own vehicles. The joint venture will start with a capital of $17.5 million and will be running by the end of March. SoftBank will hold a slight majority stake, with Toyota owning the rest. Now, automakers around the world are racing to develop the next generation of transportation technology. The SoftBank-Toyota deal shows that even the biggest players need to form alliances amid fears of getting left behind. This adds to the slew of partnerships among auto, ride-hailing, and tech companies to develop self-driving and car-sharing innovation. Earlier this week, Toyota's rival Honda said it was investing nearly $3 billion in General Motors' self-driving vehicle unit, in which SoftBank is also an investor. Let's take a look at the market reaction now. Stocks of SoftBank and Toyota both ended higher despite weakness in Japan's benchmark index Nikkei 225. Let's turn to other business stories this hour. Indonesia will launch a new strategy to fund disaster recovery. It could include selling so-called catastrophe bonds. The finance ministry says that under the strategy, the government would insure state assets against a major disaster. Jakarta will create a disaster risk financing instrument which local governments can draw upon if their budgets are wiped out by natural catastrophe. It follows the devastation in Sulawesi province that was hit by a 7.5 magnitude quake and tsunami that's killed over 1,400 people. Nissan has warned the UK that a failure to sign a trade deal with the EU would result in serious implications for Britain's manufacturing industry. With less than 6 months to go till Brexit, Prime Minister Theresa May has yet to agree on a deal that will be accepted by the EU and her divided Conservative Party. Nissan built nearly a third of all Britain's cars last year and operates the country's largest auto factory. It had all the promise of glitz and glamour with the James Bond movie, but in the end, the public listing of Aston Martin stalled on its debut in London. The share price closing nearly £1 below the £19 it floated at by the end of its first season. Now, this is the largest IPO in the global automotive sector since Italian luxury giant Ferrari listed on Wall Street 3 years ago. Aston Martin ultimately harbors grand ambitions of joining the FTSE 100 index, but it will need to deliver a significant increase in its trading price if it is to be invited to the blue chip club. So I'll be back with more in business in just a few minutes, guys.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. I'll come back to you shortly. Also ahead here on Primetime Asia, Japan bracing for yet another typhoon that's heading its way. The full story when we come back. Rosmah Mansor, wife of former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, has been charged with 17 offences under Malaysia's anti-money laundering legislation. 12 relate to money laundering and 5 charges are for failing to declare her income to tax authorities. She pleaded not guilty to all of them. Najib Razak was also back in court today over the charges already levelled against him relating to the scandal hit fund 1MDB, as Sumisha Naidu explains.
Malaysia's former Prime Minister and his wife walked out of court together on Thursday after spending their morning in separate docks. Rosmah Mansor had arrived here first, blowing kisses after having spent the night under arrest in the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission lockup. She was slapped with 17 charges under Malaysia's anti-money laundering laws for offences including allegedly receiving more than $1.7 million of illegal proceeds between 2013 and 2017 and failing to declare that income to the tax department. Unlike her husband's own 32 graft and money laundering charges, however, Rosmah's charge sheet did not explicitly state any connection to One Malaysia Development Berhad or its past subsidiaries. U.S. authorities believe more than $4.5 billion was misappropriated from 1MDB. The new Malaysian government revived local investigations after it defeated Najib's coalition, Barisan Nasional, in a historic first in May. The charges laid on Rosmah came after probes into Najib by 1MDB investigators, which resulted in the seizure of millions of dollars in cash, hundreds of luxury bags, and more than 12,000 pieces of jewellery from residences linked to the couple. But Rosmah's lawyer says it'll be up to the prosecution to make any connection between 1MDB and their client.
At this stage, not related to 1MDB is one issue. I mean, the charges don't say 1MDB. It is up to the prosecution to unfold their case, to prove their case. We'll take the case as it comes. We're in no position to now disclose our defense. We'll disclose our defense during the course of the trial.
Bail was set at 2 million ringgit or more than $482,000 with 2 conditions: that Rosmah's travel documents be surrendered and that she didn't approach any witnesses. Earlier in court, the prosecution had submitted a police report from an anti-graft investigator alleging one of their witnesses had been asked by Rosmah to give a statement favourable to her. Her lawyers say this is unfounded. Meanwhile, the reason Najib Razak was in court himself at the same time a court mention for some of his own charges was postponed to later this month, days before trial date will likely be set for Rosmah. Sumisha Naidu, Channel News Asia, Kuala Lumpur.
In Singapore, 3 opposition members of parliament are expected to appear in court tomorrow for the start of a month-long hearing. 2 civil lawsuits have been brought against them over alleged improper town council payments.
The trio are Workers' Party leaders, former Chief Lau Tiak Yang, Chairman Sylvia Lim and Secretary General Pritam Singh. They're among a group being sued by Aljunied Hougang Town Council and Pasir Ris Punggol Town Council over alleged improper payments of $33.7 million. And they're also accused of breaching their fiduciary duties to residents.
The WP MPs have said they acted in good faith and did not personally benefit in any way. Experts say the case could have wider implications as the court must determine if town councillors owe a fiduciary duty to the town councils. Currently, this is not stated in the Town Councils Act.
If the court decision imposes fiduciary obligations, the standard of responsibility goes up. To my mind, it doesn't change the context. It just simply means that when you act for someone's behalf, you manage assets for the benefit of someone else, surely you must think that you have a higher responsibility.
Let's take a quick look at other stories also making the news tonight. Japan is bracing for another typhoon, the second in less than a week. Typhoon Kongray is tracking north and is near the main island of Okinawa. Forecasts say it'll continue on that path before heading northeast. Officials are warning of strong winds, high waves, mudslides and flooding. Kongray is moving at speeds of about 144 kilometers per hour, equivalent to a Category 1 hurricane. It could hit South Korea on Saturday.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel has visited the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. Mrs. Merkel toured the museum and took part in a memorial ceremony. She said Germany had a responsibility to confront anti-Semitism and must never forget the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. The German Chancellor's visit to Israel is part of annual talks held between German and Israeli ministers.
Lawyers say their client Catherine Mayorga has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and depression after the alleged rape attack by soccer player Cristiano Ronaldo. They argue that as a result, this made her legally incompetent to reach the non-disclosure agreement she signed in 2010. They say Ms. Mayorga suffered several months of severe emotional stress and coercion by Ronaldo's representatives to take a monetary settlement. Ronaldo denies the rape accusations.
U.S. First Lady Melania Trump is in Malawi on the second leg of her Africa tour. She started the trip in Ghana, where on Wednesday she visited a slave fortress and laid a wreath. Mrs. Trump said she'd never forget the place where Africans were held before being shipped away most across the Atlantic. Her visit to Africa is her first solo international trip. Her husband, President Donald Trump, hasn't visited since taking office and was widely reported to make derisive remarks about some of the continent's countries. Still ahead, the FBI delivers its report on the sexual misconduct allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. We'll be live in Washington after the break. Welcome back to Primetime Asia. Here's a reminder of our top stories this hour. Rescuers have just one more day to find survivors from last week's devastating Indonesian earthquake and tsunami. The search is being called off tomorrow, and it comes as the National Disaster Management Agency says the death toll has risen to 1,424. But families of those missing say they're not giving up hope. More aid is finally making its way to survivors 6 days after the disaster struck, and hundreds of doctors, volunteers and emergency supplies have now been deployed in all affected regions. The military has also begun evacuating the injured and families with young children. Elsewhere, the wife of Malaysia's former Prime Minister Najib Razak has been charged with 17 counts of money laundering and tax evasion. Now, her lawyer says none of the charges are related to the 1MDB scandal. 66-year-old Rosma Mansour has pleaded not guilty. Bail has been set at just over $480,000. The White House has received the FBI's report into the sexual misconduct allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, and it's been passed on to senators to review before they vote on whether to confirm Mr. Kavanaugh or not. Now, a tweet from the Deputy Press Secretary Raj Shah says the White House is fully confident that he will be elected to Supreme Court despite the accusations from 3 women that Mr. Kavanaugh was sexually assaulted them. Now, ahead of that report, the Senate's Republican leadership set up a procedural vote for as early as Friday. A final confirmation vote could follow on Saturday. So for more on this, let's go to Simon Marks. He's in Washington, D.C. right now. Simon, have we heard anything about what the report says, and how likely is this to stop Mr. Kavanaugh's confirmation, though?
Well, the White House, Glenda, took the rather unusual step of putting a news statement out at 2:30 in the morning here, confirming that they had received the FBI documents, that they had reviewed them, and that they had transmitted them over to the U.S. Senate, where in about 30 minutes' time, Republicans and then Democrats in hour-by-hour increments will get a chance themselves to review the documents in a secure room up on Capitol Hill. The White House, in its statement, said it was now fully confident that Brett Kavanaugh would be confirmed to the Supreme Court. They say that the documents found contain no corroboration of any of the allegations of sexual assault made against him. But critics of the process say, well, of course they wouldn't contain corroboration, because this inquiry by the FBI was so brief, so limited in scope, that at least 20 potential witnesses out there say they were never contacted by the agency. Indeed, the agency says that it interviewed only 9 people of 10 people that it hoped to interview during the course of this process. One of them, we know, was a second accuser, Deborah Ramirez, but a third accuser, Julie Swetnick, was not interviewed by the agency. So the White House can look at this and say, look, this just proves what a solid nominee Brett Kavanaugh is. It's time for the Senate to vote and put him in his rightful place on the Supreme Court. But White House critics will be able equally to look at these documents and say this additional FBI investigation was so limited and so quickly accomplished that it still leaves an enormous number of unanswered questions.
And some of the questions also centered around the honesty of Kavanaugh when it came to his sort of drinking past, if you like. Many of the people coming forward are saying that the picture he described during his testimony or during the hearing wasn't what they remember or recall with him growing up.
Yeah, but there's no evidence, Steve, that the FBI has zeroed in on that at all during the course of this additional inquiry. And there's no question also that that was always going to be treacherous terrain for Brett Kavanaugh, because it is pretty apparent that during his testimony last Thursday up on Capitol Hill, when he very angrily rebuffed the allegations that had been made against him, he also was not entirely truthful, according to many friends and former associates, about the nature of his relationship with alcohol. 650 members of the legal profession, and a growing number, because they're still taking signatures on this document, have published an open letter in the New York Times in its Thursday edition here today, saying that they don't believe that Brett Kavanaugh has the character or the qualifications to serve on the Supreme Court. It now comes down to a couple of Democrats and 3 wavering Republicans. We're looking at about 5 members of the U.S. Senate. They hold the key to whether Brett Kavanaugh is going to make it onto the bench, or whether the White House is going to suffer what would be a disastrous defeat on Capitol Hill if it indeed occurs.
All right, many thanks for that. Simon Marks speaking to us from Washington, D.C. The Netherlands says its intelligence service thwarted a Russian cyber attack back in April. It says the target was the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, and has called on Moscow to cease its cyber activities aimed at undermining Western democracies. It comes as Britain accused Russia's military intelligence service, the GRU, of mounting cyber attacks on global organizations. UK Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson condemned Russia for taking the actions of a pariah state. Britain's National Cybersecurity Centre says the GRU was almost certainly responsible for 4 recent hacks, as well as a wave of attacks since 2015. Targets include the US Democratic Party ahead of the 2016 presidential election. The US sanctioned GRU officers in 2016 and 2018. Relations between the UK and Russia have also soured following a nerve agent attack in Salisbury on former Russian spy Sergei Skripal back in March. Both Australia and New Zealand have backed Britain's accusations. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said while Australia was not targeted, the attacks have caused damage and disruption. Elsewhere, the accusations from the UK and the Netherlands come as Australia's parliament is preparing to vote on a law meant to protect the countries from a heightened risk of terror attacks. But for global giants or tech giants, rather Facebook, Apple, Alphabet and Amazon say they'll oppose it. The law would require them to provide access to private encrypted data linked to suspected illegal activities. Australia has proposed fines of up to $7 million and prison terms for those who don't comply. If the bill becomes law, Australia will be one of the first nations to impose broad access requirements on tech companies. Other countries are watching closely as they explore similar laws. They include the so-called Five Eyes nations, which comprise of the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia and New Zealand. The five share intelligence and only last month demanded access to encrypted emails, text messages and voice communications through legislation. Tech companies have strongly opposed efforts to create what they call a backdoor to users' data. They claim it threatens the two pillars of the digital economy, that is trust and security. The parliamentary vote in Australia is expected to take place in a few weeks' time.
And for more analysis on the upcoming cyber bill, Lauren Leung, a technology lawyer from CMS Singapore, joins us in studio. Thank you very much, Lauren, for joining us. Tell us about the implications of this proposed assistance and access bill. How will it give, Australia's authorities the power to access, users' data then?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So, as you've said, the bill is designed to help law enforcement access data. We're living in a world where there's more data and more different types of data being generated every day. And the challenge is how law enforcement authorities can access that data and use that data to fight crime and to help enforce the law and to protect national security. The law, or the bill, is designed to help with that by allowing law enforcement agencies to compel organisations such as tech companies to provide assistance and access to data, including encrypted data.
So help us understand then the concerns that these tech companies have with allowing governments this sort of access.
So the concerns that the tech companies have are centred around how broad the bill is. So not only does the bill apply to companies in Australia, but it also applies to companies outside of Australia, as long as they're providing a service or product into Australia that is used in Australia or can be used in Australia. So this could apply to, say, hardware manufacturers who make a single component in a phone that could be used in Australia, or any company that provides a website that could be accessed in Australia. The second part to this is the breadth of what you can be asked to do. So essentially, law enforcement authorities can ask you to do a whole range of things to help them access data, from removing electronic protection or decrypting data to changing the service that you're providing or replacing it with a different service, or installing software that the government has given you into your systems, or even helping the government to build new technologies and capabilities. So, and on top of that, you could also be asked to hide the fact that you've done any of these things.
Right. Okay, but then the question is that, you have Amazon and you have Alphabet, you have all these companies, they pride themselves on giving you the encrypted data, and yet now the country or the government wants them to reveal that information. How can they marry this two then? It's a very delicate dance that they have to do.
Exactly, and that's the concern that tech companies have. This is our data, our personal data, or the contents of our communications, our emails, our messages, our online banking transactions. And as you say, tech companies pride themselves on saying, we protect your information, and, you can trust the digital economy, you can protect our technologies that look after your data. And so the challenge is how we can provide access to that data for legitimate law enforcement purposes while not compromising privacy and security and maintaining trust in the digital economy. And I think what tech companies are pushing for is that there are sufficient and appropriate checks and balances in the laws to make sure we can balance those competing interests.
Do they have a strong leg to stand on with that regard then? Because, I mean, obviously, if they were to be, these things that the governments want are very onerous and will impact them in a lot of in terms of costs and things. Is it more perhaps that they're leaning on sort of the principles that they're standing on rather than wanting to have to go down the road of forking out money to comply?
Well, they certainly have well-placed concerns, I think, because as you've mentioned, while the law is designed to help national security, the tech companies' concerns are that it could, in fact, undermine security, and that by opening up access to data, in fact, we're weakening the technologies that protect our data and ultimately, undermining trust in the digital economy.
Okay, you mentioned they protect data, but, just recently, Facebook has just, lost all that data. So, picking up on what Steve has said, do they still have the credibility to say, don't worry, it's encrypted, because no longer is, because all that data has been lost already. All our information is out there.
Well, I think we'd like to think that they're still trying their best to protect their data, and the concern is that this bill would undermine that.
And do you think then that this bill, if it's passed, do you think that, other countries like, Singapore, will they, also look at it and say, now we're going to implement it? Is that fear that, other countries are going to start implementing it soon then?
Certainly. Well, the challenges faced by law enforcement aren't unique to Australia. And some of the countries we've already mentioned, the Five Eyes countries, the UK, New Zealand, already have similar legislation in place, although not as far-reaching as this proposed bill in Australia, and certainly other nations will be looking with interest to implement similar laws.
I suppose one of the complications comes with the different jurisdictions that these companies operate. I mean, that Facebook, for example, operates in sort of every country, and if they have different laws placed on them by different countries, that does make their sort of internal sort of management of how they manage data that much more complicated.
That's right, and because of the global nature of how these companies operate and data flows, essentially, once the high watermark has been set, it would be difficult not to comply.
Yeah, certainly would be a precedent set by Australia, and we'll see how that moves forward. Thanks very much, Lauren Leung, there, technology lawyer from CMS Singapore.
Thank you.
And still to come on Primetime Asia, another tie-up is on the cards for two companies here in Singapore. We'll tell you what it's all about after the break.
Welcome back. CapitaLand has secured a 5-year, 300 million Singapore dollar sustainability loan from DBS. The real estate firm claims that this is the largest sustainability-linked financing provided by a sole lender in Singapore. The sustainability loan allows CapitaLand to have the flexibility to use the loan for general corporate purposes. Now, it differs from green loans, where proceeds are applied towards the funding of a specific project. CapitaLand says that the loan dovetails into its larger environmental, social and governance efforts, which it has received recognition for after being listed on the Dow Jones Sustainability World Index. The firm also notes that there are financial incentives in undertaking a sustainability-linked loan.
In the current era of rising interest rates, the sustainability-linked loan that we've just put in place has a very interesting feature which allows for the cost of the loan to actually potentially go down the better we do at our ESG efforts. So we are directly incentivized to do better, which will bring the cost of funding down over the life of the loan.
Elsewhere in business this hour, Grab and Deals platform Fave, formerly known as Groupon Singapore, have announced a strategic tie-up to boost growth across Southeast Asia. The partnership combines Fave's broad merchant network and Deals platform with Grab's large user base. Starting this week, Fave's sales team will bring on board merchants for Grab Food and Grab Pay in Singapore and Malaysia. Now, later this month, it will integrate Grab Pay as one of its payment options. This will allow Fave customers to use their GrabPay balance on Fave's site. Comcast says it has secured over 75% of Sky's shares, much earlier than it had anticipated. Comcast had previously said it hoped the acquisition would be complete by the end of October. The acquisition brings it closer to finalizing the $40 billion takeover of the British pay TV group. Comcast won a controlling stake in Sky last month after edging out Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox. And that's your business update this hour, guys.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. Still to come here on Primetime Asia. The Asian Para Games is almost upon us. What do you know about the sport of boccia? We'll explain and we'll examine the crucial role.
The sports assistant is like the hands and the leg for the athlete.
Yes, as I said, we'll explain it all and show you what it is when we come back.
NewsAsia.
Welcome back. Now we're just 2 days away from the Asian Para Games and the last batch of Team Singapore athletes. They've left for the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. 9 of them were given a send-off earlier today at Singapore's Changi Airport.
They are part of a 44-strong contingent who will be participating at the 3rd edition of the Games. In Icheon 4 years ago, Singapore won a gold, a silver and 4 bronzes. This time, Team Singapore's boccia players will be gunning for glory in Jakarta together with their volunteers. Take a look.
The objective sounds simple enough: to get the ball as close to the white target ball as possible. The process, though, is a whole new ball game. 25-year-old boccia athlete To Zining has cerebral palsy and can only move her head. Her eyes are fixed on the goal, and the volunteers' eyes are firmly on her. Zining relies on Chu Zichun to execute her game plan.
The sports assistant is like the hands and the leg for the athlete. So basically, we just get instruction from the athlete to, like shift the ramp or shift the chair.
It's a routine they are used to. Together, they took part in 12 overseas and local competitions like the ASEAN Para Games and Rio Paralympic Games, winning 8 medals in total. Off the court, the partnership evolves into something else. 26-year-old Zichun becomes a friend, a sister, and a caregiver rolled into one.
I'm really grateful for Jessie, even though she's not my family member, but she's still willing to help me in and out of training and competition.
When competing overseas, the playing partner's responsibilities extend to everyday life, including feeding and showering the athlete and changing her diaper. At this Asian Para Games, Zichun will take on a new role as the boccia coach. Zining's sister will take over Zichun's position. Most boccia playing partners are related to the athletes because of the daily tasks involved. Fei Lim is heading to the games with her father, Lim Boon Gi. She can't talk. Their mode of communication? Hand gestures.
To help her, you need to be a pair and partner, which you really understand what she talks. In terms of sign language, it's a kind of very good time for us to be born together when we play the game.
The Singapore Disability Sports Council says the work of these volunteers must not go unnoticed.
If you look at the public policies or corporate policies nowadays, they do recognize national athletes, national coaches and technical officials, but not in terms of volunteers, caregivers. Yeah, so we do hope that a lot more can be done.
For the volunteers, the chance to help the athletes in their quest for glory is the best reward they can ask for.
Now, before we go, let's go back to our top story. And that's the devastating quake and tsunami that hit Indonesia's Sulawesi island nearly 1 week ago. Rescue teams face the deadline of tomorrow to stop searching for survivors, but the families of those missing say they are not giving up hope.
And we'll be bringing you their stories from our correspondents on the ground and keeping up with the latest relief efforts. You can catch that all here on Channel NewsAsia. In the meantime, thanks for your company here on Primetime Asia. We'll see you soon.